Hello, and thank you for coming back to watch part 7 of our Fanny Crosby story. In our story today, the new school year had just begun. Fanny stood in the open doorway, listening to the children's laughter as they played on the lawn. Crunch, crunch. Someone was walking up the driveway. Someone was crying. Fanny stepped outside and waited until the person came closer. "May I help you?" she asked gently. A small voice said brokenly, "I want to go home." Fanny reached out to the young child and pulled her to her. "Why do you want to go home, Sarah?" she asked, wiping away the tears. "Everything is so different and scary," Sarah stammered. "I'm afraid." "Why, Sarah," Fanny said, "that's exactly what I thought when I came to the Institute, and I was much older than you are. But then I made friends. Would you like to hear about my first days here?" Fanny felt the little girl nod her head. Taking her by the hand, she led Sarah inside where all was quiet so that they could talk alone. Soon Sarah's crying stopped. She even giggled. "Oh, I like you, Miss Crosby," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Fanny's neck. Everyone liked Fanny, both students and teachers. Lonely students learned that she was their friend. She listened to their problems and cheered those who were discouraged. Even teachers at the Institute asked Fanny for help. One day, Fanny heard the music teacher playing a tune on the piano. "Why, Mr. Root, how wonderful! You should publish that," Fanny exclaimed. "I have no words for the tune, Fanny. I just have the song," George Root replied. "This is what the melody says to me," Fanny said, and quoted a poem she had just thought of. Mr. Root was pleased. Throughout the summer, Fanny wrote several songs for the music teacher. Some became popular. The songs earned quite a bit of money for Mr. Root, but Fanny was only paid a few dollars. However, Fanny received something better than money. She learned she could write poems for music, which people enjoyed singing. It seemed that God was showing her which direction to take. Knowing God's will was better than any money. At the same time that Fanny was writing songs for George Root, another teacher was singing songs to Fanny. Love songs. Fanny had met him years before when the students from the Institute were on a boat trip. His mother had introduced them and told Fanny he would be going to the Institute for the Blind. Alexander Van Alstyne, or Van, as he was called, had attended the Institute, graduated, and then went to college. Now, he played the piano, organ, and trumpet. He composed songs and taught music. He returned to the Institute as a teacher. Van and Fanny were both musicians. He wrote music and she wrote poems. Van discovered that the words of the love songs he sang to Fanny was what he felt for her. "Fanny," Van began one evening, "I love you, and I would like you to be my wife. But would you want a blind man for your husband?" "If you want a blind woman for your wife, I want a blind man for my husband," Fanny replied with a laugh. "I love you, Van. Yes, I want to be your wife." Soon after that, Van left the Institute and became a private music teacher. Several months later, Fanny resigned her teaching position and also left the school. She traveled to the small New York town where Van lived. There, they were married. Fanny was now a blind housewife. Few of her neighbors knew she was a well-known poet writing her third book. She was happy with her kind, cheerful husband. Van was not only kind to Fanny, he gave music lessons to poor children in town and charged them very little. He supported Fanny by playing the organ in several churches. Their first year together went by quickly. It was an exciting day when Fanny knew she was to become a mother. Van and Fanny waited eagerly. But when the baby was born, it did not live. Fanny was very saddened when her baby died. But God soon brought along other opportunities to Fanny to find joy. The churches needed hymns and gospel songs, songs people would enjoy singing, songs which would encourage Christians to obey the Lord. A man named William Bradbury was a man who had been writing hymns since the beginning of the Great Revival. His melodies were loved by the people who sang them, but he wanted new poems to set to music. "Fanny," Mr. Bradbury said when he was introduced to her, "I thank God that we have met at last. I believe you can write hymns. I've wished for a long time to have a talk with you." He sent her home with an assignment. Fanny was to return within a week with a hymn that would show Mr. Bradbury whether or not she could write songs. What a challenge! She only had 1 week. But 3 days later, Fanny was back in the office with her first hymn. She waited while Mr. Bradbury looked at her poem. When Mr. Bradbury read the words, he said, "Fanny, I am surprised beyond measure. Let me say that as long as I have a publishing house, you will always have work here." That evening, Fanny shared the good news with her husband. "Van, God has done so much for me. He allowed me to go to school when I wanted to so much. I learned to write poetry and teach at the Institute. And best of all, I received the Lord as my Savior. God was so patient with me. He brought us together, too. And then he took our little baby to heaven. I don't know why he did that, but God is so good. He does not make mistakes. Now I feel the most important part of my life is just beginning." Fanny was ready to do God's will.